For decades, the United States has navigated a complex global landscape, identifying traditional adversaries and established powers. Yet a profound recalibration of geopolitical influence is underway, particularly across the African continent. This shift reveals a nascent, formidable challenge to American strategic interests. This emerging dynamic is not merely a consequence of external competition from rival great powers, it signifies a deeper, more fundamental transformation. The adversary is not a state actor in the conventional sense, nor is it a familiar ideological foe. It is a force born from within the continent itself. For much of the post-colonial era, U.S. engagement in Africa was predicated on a specific strategic calculus. This model often involved a blend of development aid, security assistance, and counterterrorism initiatives. The underlying assumption was that financial incentives and military training would secure enduring influence and stability. This approach manifested through significant foreign aid disbursements, often tied to specific governance reforms or economic liberalization policies. Concurrently, the U.S. military, primarily through AFRICOM, engaged in extensive training programs with African national armies. These efforts aimed to bolster regional security and counter extremist threats, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa. However, this long-standing paradigm is now demonstrably faltering. Its efficacy is being systematically undermined, not primarily by the overt actions of competing external powers, but by an internal ideological reorientation within African states. The established framework of engagement, once deemed robust, is proving increasingly untenable. The past 3 years have witnessed an unprecedented wave of military takeovers across West and Central Africa. Nations such as Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea have experienced leadership changes initiated by their own armed forces. These events are not isolated incidents, but rather symptomatic of a broader continent-wide rejection of perceived external control. These new military governments articulate a clear anti-colonialist stance. They openly challenge the historical legacies of Western intervention and the perceived neo-colonial structures that have persisted. Their rhetoric resonates deeply with populations disillusioned by decades of economic stagnation and perceived political subservience. Crucially, these leaders have moved swiftly to sever long-standing military and diplomatic ties with former colonial powers and the United States. Simultaneously, they have actively sought new strategic partnerships, notably with Russia and, to a lesser extent, with the BRICS bloc. This realignment is often met with significant popular support, reflecting a widespread desire for genuine self-determination. The prevailing narrative in Washington often attributes the decline of Western influence in Africa to the aggressive inroads made by China and Russia. While these actors certainly play a role, a more critical self-assessment reveals deeper systemic issues. The West's failure to adapt to evolving African aspirations is a primary driver of its diminishing leverage. Western institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the United Nations peacekeeping missions, are increasingly viewed with skepticism. Their conditionalities are often perceived as intrusive, and their effectiveness in addressing core security and developmental challenges is questioned. The presence of foreign military bases, once tolerated, is now seen by many as an affront to national sovereignty. In response, U.S. policy has often defaulted to reactive measures. This includes the repositioning of military assets, as seen with the withdrawal from Niger, and attempts to outbid competitors with new infrastructure and clean energy initiatives. However, these tactical adjustments fail to address the fundamental ideological shift. African leaders are prioritizing genuine sovereignty and diversified partnerships over traditional aid for influence models. The true new adversary to U.S. interests in Africa is not a conventional state or a rival superpower. It is the ascendant, ideologically driven revolutionary class within Africa itself. This cohort comprises young nationalist military officers and their civilian allies. They are deeply committed to reclaiming national agency and charting an independent course for their nations. Figures such as Captain Ibrahim Traor'e of Burkina Faso, Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali, and General Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger exemplify this new leadership. They are characterized by their unwavering commitment to national interests, their rejection of perceived Western hegemony, and their willingness to forge new alliances based on mutual respect and non-interference. Their influence extends beyond mere political power. They are actively shaping a new narrative of African self-reliance and defiance. This movement is gaining significant traction among the youth and broader populations, who view these leaders as champions of genuine liberation. They are challenging the established global order not through direct military confrontation, but through a strategic reorientation of alliances and a profound ideological shift. The strategies employed by these new African leaders pose a direct challenge to the existing international order. They are actively pursuing deeper integration with BRICS nations, seeking alternative financial and trade mechanisms that bypass traditional Western-dominated institutions. This includes the nationalization of key natural resources, asserting greater control over their economic destinies. Furthermore, these governments are meticulously controlling national narratives, leveraging state media and popular support to counter external influences and promote their vision of a sovereign Africa. This is not merely a regional phenomenon, it represents a fundamental redefinition of Africa's role on the global stage. It signals a move away from the traditional East-West dichotomy towards a multipolar world where African agency is paramount. This emerging African identity is characterized by fierce independence, a rejection of historical subjugation, and an unapologetic assertion of power. As this ideology gains momentum and spreads across the continent, the traditional frameworks of Western engagement will find themselves increasingly obsolete. The implications for global governance, resource allocation, and international security are profound. Should these trends persist, the geopolitical landscape of 2030 will look dramatically different. Projections suggest a significant reduction in U.S. military presence across Africa, potentially by half, as host nations increasingly assert their sovereignty. Concurrently, trade and investment between BRICS nations and Africa are poised for exponential growth, potentially doubling within the decade. This shift will inevitably lead to a reevaluation of global institutions. Africa, with its growing economic and demographic weight, will demand a more equitable voice within bodies like the United Nations and the World Bank. The continent's collective assertion of independence could fundamentally reshape the global economic and political order, fostering a more decentralized and multipolar system. For the West, this represents a significant strategic setback, challenging decades of established foreign policy. For Africa, it heralds a new era of self-determination and liberation from historical constraints. For the world, it signifies the undeniable emergence of a new global balance of power where the voices and choices of the global South hold unprecedented sway. The era of external powers dictating Africa's trajectory is drawing to a close. The continent is asserting its agency, driven by a new generation of leaders and a populace demanding genuine sovereignty. This profound shift is reshaping not just regional dynamics, but the very architecture of global power. Africa is unequivocally declaring its terms, a rejection of military dependence, a demand for equitable partnerships, and an unwavering commitment to building its future on its own foundations. This is not merely a political statement, it is a strategic imperative. To remain informed on these critical geopolitical transformations and to gain expert insights beyond the headlines, subscribe, like, and share to Politics, Power, and Policy. Engage with our in-depth analyses and join the discourse shaping tomorrow's world. And until next time, my friends, stay safe and informed.